So what we need to remember is that this is the first step in establishing negligence. It doesn't mean you're negligent, it's just the first step, and it's called the duty of care. So how do we establish that we owe a duty of care? Well, there's really two kinds of situations that we're dealing with. In the first, we have an act or omission, that's the conduct, and it leads to generally some physical harm. In the second, that we've been dealing with, we're dealing with the situation of economic loss, right? Of pure economic loss. And we're really dealing with a statement that leads to that economic loss. So it's dealing with negligent misstatement. I won't go into the detail of why it's important, but this idea of economic loss is central to why things are the way that they are in this particular area of law. Okay, so if we have an act or omission, there are two ways we can owe a duty. The first way is if we have an established category, and slide 16 tells us that. The second way is if we don't have an established category, then we actually have a test that we apply, and that can be found on slide 21. If we're not dealing with this kind of act or omission, and we're dealing with some form of statement leading to economic loss, then there are two different situations. In the first situation, we're dealing with direct advice, okay, where the defendant gave advice to the plaintiff. In the second, we're dealing with indirect advice. So the defendant gave advice to someone else, let's call them a client, and then they gave advice to the plaintiff. The test for the direct advice situation is on slide 28, and for the indirect situation is slide 30. This situation is kind of summarized for you in a different way on slide 32. And on slide 32, it's essentially saying, that there are three ways, and it uses 1, 2, 3, A and B. Although, personally, to me, it makes a little more sense to think about these 4 different situations. Let's have a look at those particular slides just to recap. So the first situation we have is where the courts have considered the particular kind of relationship, and it's an established category. If we're in an established category, we will owe a duty of care. If we're not in an established category, right, if the relationship isn't one of those that the courts have considered, then there is a 2-stage test. The plaintiff must show it's reasonably foreseeable that the defendant's conduct could cause harm, Borhill and Young or Donoghue and Stevenson are our authorities. And also the plaintiff must show that the salient features of the case are consistent with the existence of the duty. So therefore, if we have an act or omission, there are 2 ways, right? We can show it: established category or this 2-part test. If there's been some economic harm or loss as the result of advice, then we have a different way of approaching the problem. It becomes a problem of negligent misstatement. And what we can see here is the test of if that advice is direct. If the defendant has given advice to the plaintiff, they will owe a duty of care where that advice is of a business or serious nature. The defendant knew or should have known that the plaintiff intended to rely on the advice, and it was reasonable in the circumstances for the plaintiff to rely on that advice. In a situation where the defendant has given the advice to someone other than the plaintiff, where will a defendant owe a duty to a third party? That occurs where they give their client, where the person who they give the advice to, they know that that person is going to communicate that advice to someone else. Where they know that, and where that is likely to lead the third party or the end person who gets the advice to enter into a type of transaction, and that third party will suffer loss if they enter into that transaction if the advice is wrong, then the originator of the advice will owe a duty. That's a little bit of a complicated test, so it might be best if you go back and rewatch the video on that if you're not understanding that particular slide. So just to summarize again, you will owe a duty of care if it's an established category. If it's not an established category and it's reasonable foreseeability and salient features of the case, we need both of those elements met. If it's about negligent misstatement, that advice that leads to an economic loss, right, then we must satisfy the negligent misstatements for 3A, the direct advice, the three-stage test, and the indirect test. And those 4 ways of establishing a duty of care are what's core to this particular area.